Hey, what's up everyone? It's me, Retrovan, and we're going to be talking about the plot of the Crash Bandicoot series. Now, the plot's all over the place, so it is going to get a little confusing, but I'll try to explain it in the best possible way I can. So the plot of the first Crash game is an evil scientist named Dr. Cortex is collecting different animals and experimenting with them. And one of his best creations, in his opinion, was a bandicoot called Crash. And Crash was put on the, basically this machine that was going to make him a loyal soldier to Cortex, like a general of sorts. But when he went in the machine, everything messed up and Crash got his brains all over the place. So Crash now, going all wacky, starts to run out and he escapes. So Cortex has to use his girlfriend Tana. Realizing what he had to do, Crash, once he lands on the island, realizes that he's got to go back to Cortex to save his girlfriend Tana. First, they'll have to go through different wildlife and the beach levels and the jungle levels. Then he finds the natives of Insanity Island, which are tribesmen, and you even get to fight their tribesman leader. Another thing to know is you can also ride a pig, or a hog, some would call it. After that first island, Crash ends up on the second island where he goes through a creek. He fights a crazy dog that he's literally strapped up. That's how crazy the Ripperoo is. You also go through temples, bridge levels, all sorts of stuff in that island. So it's a little different from the first island. The first island was more natural. The second island is like lost civilization kind of stuff. Once you get through that island, you fight Koala Kong. I know, ironic name. He throws rocks at you and you gotta beat him that way. After all that, Crash ends up in the third and final island where he's gotta go through Cortex's different factories. Once he gets through some of the factories, he has to fight one of Cortex's elite minions, Pinstripe, and yeah, he's got a real gun that he shoots at Crash. Once you beat him, you gotta go through another bridge level, and then you go into some more temples, and then you get up to Cortex Castle, which is like the final act of the game, where you have to go through more factories, Cortex's like lab area. And once you get through all that, you gotta fight his second in command, Embryo. And Embryo, he has a lot of interesting power-ups. He hulks up during the boss fight, which is pretty wild. But after you beat him, that's when you finally get to go after Cortex, and you gotta fight him from his blimp as his island's burning. So all is well, Crash defeats him and saves the girl, but she would never show up in the franchise again until a lot later for some reason. There's a fan theory that what happened to Tana is she got with Pinstripe, which is pretty sad. Crash basically got fucked. The second game starts right after the ending of the first game, where Cortex has fallen down to his island. He notices something, though, as he falls. He notices a crystal, and that's when the classic line...
Crystals. Of course.
...comes into play. And then, goes a year later to where Cortex is working on a space station now. And now Cortex has an idea where he wants to get Crash to get the crystals for him by lying to him and saying that he's a changed man. Before that, though, Crash is sitting there on the island with Coco. I didn't mention Coco because she wasn't in the first game at all. She kind of just shows up. Probably another Cortex experiment. And she wants Crash to go get batteries for her laptop, so Crash gets up, he goes a little bit through the level, and then he gets teleported to Cortex's warp room. Cortex explains to Crash that, hey man, I'm a good guy, I'm not a bad guy anymore, and I need you to get the crystals so we can stop the evil. Crash, not being the brightest person out there, believes him, so he starts collecting crystals. But you can also collect gems as well, and if you collect your first gem, you'll get a message from Cortex's former second-in-command, Embryo, who will tell Crash to get all the gems to stop Cortex, because Cortex is lying. They got some pretty unique levels, too. They got a snow level, another jungle level, kind of like the first game, another boulder level, and just all sorts of cool levels. But after you do all that, Cortex informs you that rogue people are trying to fight Crash and take his crystals. So his first boss is the reformed Ripperoo from the first game. He's now a fancy aristocratic man. Although that's just a veil, because he does eventually go crazy during the boss fight. Once you get to the second warp room, you have a lot of interesting things you can go do. There's a rocket surfboard you can go on in a sort of an up the creek kind of level. You get to ride a polar bear and all sorts of stuff. You also get to go in the stinky, slimy sewers. After Crash gets through the parts in the second warp room, he has to fight another boss, and this time he's got to fight some new people, the Komodo Bros. And the Komodo Bros are pretty decently challenging boss. They work together, they'll like spin each other and all that stuff, but once you sort of get the patterns, and that's a lot of Crash bosses, it's not too bad. There's not too much to mention in terms of the levels, but I will say that there are a few new levels. There's a temple level, kind of like what was in the first game, and aside from that, it's kind of mostly the same, just different versions of said levels. So after you complete them, then you fight another boss fight with Tiny Tiger, another new character, and his boss is pretty simple. You just gotta like learn the patterns of where he's jumping and when the pads fall and all that. There are a few newer levels worth mentioning in the fourth warp room. In that, there are bee-themed levels where you gotta run from bees and all that. But other than that, that's the only new kind of level there. So after that warp room, you have to fight Dr. Engine, Cortex's new second-in-command, and he's got a pretty interesting boss fight where you gotta fight his little floating mech thing with Wampa Fruit. Somehow that takes it out pretty good. Now, the fifth warp room's a little different than what I mentioned before, because there are a fair amount of new levels this time, and all of them are in Cortex's space station now. So Cortex reveals that he was lying to Crash and that he's gonna find a way to get all the crystals. So Crash has to go through Cortex's space station. He gets to ride a jetpack, and then he also goes through a night level with a nightlight thing. After that, the finale is on. Crash has to chase after Cortex in his space station before he gets away with all the crystals. Crash does manage to succeed and gets Cortex, although now he has to get all the gems, which is the replayability of the game. And once he gets all the gems, Embryo will power a machine that shoots down Cortex's space station. Unbeknownst to them, though, this then begins the plot of the third Crash Bandicoot. My favorite one, Crash Bandicoot Warped, where the space station is now crashing down onto Earth. And unbeknownst to Crash and the gang, that actually caused a really bad effect, because it crashed into the temple of Aku Aku, the masked brother, his evil brother, Uka Uka, and now he was free, ready to put his wrath out. He lambasts Cortex for failing him twice, and Cortex apologizes, so Uka Uka says, "Alright, third try's a charm, I'm gonna give you another chance, but there's now gonna be help." And that help is Dr. N Trophy, who is a master of time. So the plot of this game is very time-themed compared to the first two. And then after all that, Aku Aku recognizes Uka Uka's laugh and has to tell Crash and the gang about Uka Uka and how he was locked away and how they gotta stop him again. And the third game is not too different from how the second game is, because you still have to collect 25 crystals and 5 warp rooms. The first warp room has some pretty interesting starter levels. You start in a medieval themed level, then there's an underwater level, then there's a prehistoric level, then there's one that takes place in like the pirate times where you have to like ski as Coco. Forgot to mention you can play as Coco in this one. There's also a tiger riding game in the Great Wall of China, and that one's pretty fun. After all that, you get another repeat boss from the second game, Tiny Tiger. Although his patterns are a little different and the boss is a bit different than the one in Crash 2. This time he's in like a gladiator arena, and Crash has to defeat him. Although, you do have to worry about lions running through. And oh yeah, after defeating bosses in this game, you now get power-ups, and after beating Tiny Tiger, you get a body slam. Some of the different power-ups you can get is the double jump, a triple spin, bazooka, and you get to do like a running thing, so that helps you with the time trials in the game. The second warp room has some pretty interesting levels to note. There's like an India level that takes place in like, like Aladdin times. There's a 50s motorcycle riding one where you get to ride with like cool glasses and a jacket. You also get to go in a tomb level that's like Egyptian based, which I thought was pretty unique as well. Although, as a not big fan of snakes, I'm not a big fan that the enemies in that level are snakes. After that, you have to fight Dingodile in a sort of Ice Age level, and it's unique because he's in a snow level, but he uses fire. That's his weapon. And he's called Dingodile because he's a mix of a crocodile and a dingo. And he's got an interesting sort of pattern. He shoots his fire up in the air first, and then after that, the pattern is he starts shooting his flamethrower forward, which breaks the ice around him, which gives you a chance to hit him. There's not really anything to say about the third warp room, because now at this point it's just repeated levels. So they're like harder versions of previous levels that have a different layout, but a very similar theme. So after that, boss number 3 is the Dr. N trophy guy that I talked about at the beginning, and he's got a pretty unique boss fight. He'll shoot like different rays at you, and then when he's done, he'll like sort of stop for a second, and you gotta jump all the way to him from the other side. And once you hit him, he gets all whacked up, and then he goes to the other side, and cycle repeats. Pretty interesting boss, and can be pretty tough at times, too. The fourth warp room has 2 unique levels I can talk about. There's Bye Bye Blimps, which takes place during one of the World Wars, where Crash is like fighting World War II planes, basically, and, taking out blimps. Then the next level is Future Frenzy, which, as you can tell, takes place in the future. After that, you fight Engine once again. His boss fight's a little different, because in Engine's boss fight, you fight him as Crash's sister Coco in like a spaceship thing, and he's got like another giant mech, and Coco has to take him out. It's a pretty interesting boss fight. You just gotta shoot the yellow points basically and avoid his shots and all that, but aside from that, not too bad of a boss fight. Then we get to Warp Room 5, and there's only one level of interest to really mention, and that's Bug Light. Bug Light's a pretty interesting level. It's kind of like the dark levels in Crash 2, where you have to have like a little light source to help you through the dark. Although this time it's in a tomb rather than in the jungle like it was in the previous game. After that, you have an epic boss fight between Cortex, Uka Uka, and Aku Aku and Crash, and the 2 masks fight, while Crash and Cortex fight at the same time, so you have to avoid the mask's attacks while Cortex is also trying to attack you pretty much. If you also got all the gems, once you defeat Cortex, you'll get the secret ending where him, Uka Uka, and Dr. N Trophy get teleported to the past and turned into babies. We then skip heavily forward in terms of the game releases to Crash 4. And this is sort of my fan theory of how it's supposed to be, so this isn't entirely correct, but this is like the only way I can connect these games. So Crash 4 starts with N Trophy, Cortex, and Uka Uka, years later stuck in the past, finally figuring out a way to get back after growing up again. So Cortex obviously had a lot of time to plan and prepare to take out Crash again, and Uka Uka is trying to open up a portal to let them get out, and eventually he succeeds, but he ends up falling and, passing out. So N Trophy and Cortex get through the portal, and they go to wherever they're going now to figure out their evil plans, with N Trophy as the main villain now. We then start with Crash just chilling on the beach, and Aku Aku has to interrupt him and let him know that, he senses a great evil afoot. So Crash goes exploring through the jungles, more temples and all that. And once he gets through there, he goes to a mysterious temple, and within that mysterious temple, he discovers a new mask. And this mask is very unique because he can basically switch the physical look of objects. So if there's an object that's like invisible, then he can make it solid, basically. But it also switches other objects and makes them not solid. So it's kind of like a little puzzle platforming sort of thing. You also get chased by a freaky monster, which is I don't know what you'd call him. He's like a temple monster or something. Then you go to a desert level that has a lot of metal and crazy stuff like that, and the boss in that level is Engine, who, he seems to be getting into, like, drumming now. Kinda has, like, a Mad Max sort of feel to it, where you're, like, running on a roller, and this game is, like, a lot of running from things compared to some of the other games. After you get through that, you have to face Engine in a boss fight where he utilizes his new drumming abilities. And once you defeat him, then that's when you go to the pirate-themed level. And in that level, you meet, you guessed it, Tana. Tana returns once again, although it's not the same Tana that Crash and Coco knew originally. It is alternate dimension Tana. And from her explanation, apparently her version of Crash and Coco are deceased. The next level you go to is sort of a Japanese-themed level, and in this one you have to fight Embryo once again. The new mask you get is a spinning mask where you get to spin around and like jump really high in the air. For some reason they never explain it, but he's working for the bad guys again. And once you get through those temples, you have to fight him in a very similar boss fight to the previous Embryo boss fights, or I say previous boss fights, but there's only one fight.
Michael, wake up!
No.
So you take him out, and then you go to like a swampy level. Although that level has like a really interesting party going on, and really cool section. Probably one of the best levels in that game. And then after that, you run to Dingle again, who's now opened his own little restaurant. And he seems to not be evil anymore. He doesn't use his flamethrower anymore, he now uses like a sucker thing. At the end of the level, you unlock the mask Kapunawa, which is a time-themed mask, and you get to use that in the next few levels. The next level is a snow-themed level, and in the snow-themed level, you get to utilize the time mask a little more. And then you get to fight Cortex once again. Although once you defeat Cortex this time, he seems kind of tired of, you know, the whole evil shtick. And he's like telling Crash, like,
Around and around like this. Tell me, Crash, is this all there is? Forever?
And then after that, N Trophy reveals that he doesn't need Cortex anymore, and now he's gonna go through with his own plans. So now Cortex has to work with Crash and the gang, and they have to go through a prehistoric level next, and as they go through that, they meet the mask Ika, which Ika is kind of unique because he can basically like mess with gravity, so you can like walk up in the air or do all crazy stuff like that. The next level is a space-themed level with aliens and whatnot. And in that level, you finally get to reunite with Dingle and Tana, and they find out that Dingle-Dial's like actually a good guy now, and he's just sort of doing his own thing. They get through Dr. Nitrous Oxide ship. Dr. N Trophy has a female version of him from another dimension, and they're a little more close than for comfort.
You manage our affairs with such poise.
Naturally, as do you. Ah.
Barf.
Eventually they go down to the alien planet and have to explore through that. And after they do that, they fight the two N Trophies and end up defeating them. Everything seems alright, because now they're going to the future and they seem to just sort of be enjoying themselves, and Cortex and Dingle and Crash and Coco all go through their own little levels. Although at the end, Cortex reveals that he has a plan for revenge, so he captures the Time Mask so he can go back in time to stop him from messing up and making Crash the way he did. So Crash and them have to go after him, and Tana tells him to
Give him hell!
They get back to the past in Cortex's old factory, and things kind of don't go the way Cortex was expecting, because the past Cortex thinks that the current Cortex is like a trick or something. So he sets up all his defenses, so that kind of makes it a little difficult for Cortex to do all that stuff. But you go through the Cortex castle and his different factories, and once you get to the end, the current Cortex captures the past Cortex so he can fight Crash, and after Crash defeats him, he gets all beat up and stuff, and the past Cortex gets released to work on Crash like he was doing in the first game. Although there's an interesting twist that the whole reason Crash's thing got messed up was from Crash himself, because Crash accidentally messes with the buttons that makes the machine go awry. The masks banish the present Cortex to a different place so that he can't do anything anymore. And everything seems all peachy, you know, everybody's relaxing now and back at the beach. And Cortex seems to be happy that he's now getting some peace and free time. Although that wouldn't last for very long, as Uka Uka makes his return. And now, after doing Crash 4, we're going to skip all the way back down to Crash Bandicoot The Wrath of Cortex, the original Crash Bandicoot 4. And it starts with Cortex and the gang, and Uka Uka basically, you know, sitting in a space station, and Uka Uka's telling them that their track record for spreading evil is pathetic and really bad. Engine accidentally slips up and reveals that Cortex has been working on something, and that something is a new Super Bandicoot, Crunch Bandicoot, that Cortex has been working on. And Uka Uka says, well, we can also use the elemental masks, different from the masks in Crash 4, to work with Crunch to take out Crash. And because the masks are elementals, they mess with the weather, and as Crash and Coco are just casually skiing, the weather's like all stormy, volcanoes are erupting, and all sorts of crazy stuff. So they go to the new warp room that they got to figure out what's going on, and once they go there, Cortex gets in communication with them and tells them about how he's got a new Bandicoot even better than Crash named Crunch. And Crunch tells Crash,
This is the creature who keeps sabotaging your master plan? Ha! You gotta be kidding! I'll exterminate this field rat in no time!
you first have to go through the Earth Chamber, and the Earth Chamber has some interesting levels. There's a snow level called Arctic Antics. There's a level called Tornado Alley that's like in Nebraska, where you gotta shoot the tornado-making machines. There's a cool little ball level you get to roll around in the jungle. There's like a medieval wizard sort of level. And then there's a factory level called Compactor Reactor where you gotta ride a minecart. And once you get done with the minecart, it's a platforming section. So after you do that, this is going to be a little different from the other ones. Instead of fighting a bunch of bosses, you're fighting Crunch Bandicoot with different elemental masks. And the first mask you have to fight is the Earth mask, and that boss fight is basically rolling around in like a dome sort of thing, and you gotta like get all the rocks to your color so that you can take him out. The next level is a jungle level where you get to ride a jeep as well. There's also another underwater level returning from Crash 3. You also have a cool little Japan level where you get to play as Coco. And then there's also called the level That Sinking Feeling, which is basically you get to fly like a weird looking plane and you gotta take out a bunch of boats. And like the first warp room, there's another factory level you go in. In this one, you kind of swim through it, and it's like a water factory, underwater sort of base, pretty much. Now we go to the third warp room, and in the third warp room, there's another Coco level where you gotta run from a tsunami. There's a really annoying race level called Smokey and the Bandicoot. There's also another ball level, but in the snow. And then there's another factory level, but in this one you fly like a little helicopter thing, and you go to another platforming factory to get to the fire boss. You fight with him and Crunch, and it's actually a pretty unique boss fight, because in this boss fight you get to use Crash's mech and you have to chase after him and spray him with water to get the fire out, and once you do that, that's pretty much it for that boss. The next warp room is the air warp room, and the levels there, you get a avalanche snow level where you get to play as Coco again, a space station level where you get to use a mech at it, a flying space level, and a flying factory in the air. Now the fourth boss is kind of similar to the engine boss fight from Crash 3, although this time you're playing as Crash, and you have to shoot down the air Crunch with your plane. It's a little tough, but it's you eventually can get it. In terms of the final warp room, you have a volcanic island level, a gold rush, like western sort of level, a medieval ball level, and then another space station level. After that, you have to fight Crunch in the final boss fight, and he utilizes all the elemental mass for that boss fight. And once you defeat him, you come to learn that Crunch was actually mind controlled the whole time, and he was forced to sort of do Cortex's bidding for him. So he tries to go after Cortex, and Uka Uka gets mad and basically shoots towards Cortex, which he avoids, and when he shoots at it, it messes up the space station, so Crash and them have to escape. Sadly for Cortex and Uka Uka, they end up on like an ice platform at the end of the game, basically stuck there until the next game. Crunch now becomes part of the Bandicoot gang, and they talk it out pretty much, and that's the end of the Wrath of Cortex. Crash Twinsanity starts off with Cortex and Uka Uka's frozen bodies floating in the sea, going towards Insanity Island. Coco's just kind of doing her own thing, you know, chilling, and Cortex gets a little brainwashing ray that freezes her, and then he dresses up as her to trick Crash. And Crash, you know, not being the brightest dude, you know, he follows him. But before that, you got a pretty cool open section you can go through and explore. Once you get to the end of the level, Cortex reveals that he's not actually Crash's sister, and now you gotta fight him. And all of his friends, quote-unquote, are here, his previous enemies he had to face. So now Crash has to fight Cortex, and once he takes out Cortex, a giant mech Bandicoot comes in with an engine controlling him, so you gotta fight him, and once you defeat him, he kind of falls, and Cortex gets all, like, messed up, and his little hover thing pushes Crash down into the cavern. And Cortex gets so mad that he jumps at Crash, and they start to roll through the caves. A lot of crazy stuff happens in the caves. They gotta fight, like, some ant alien dudes. And now Crash and Cortex have to work together. Cortex is holding on to Crash, though, because he got a crystal when he was exploring, so now he's like trying to take it from Crash. And as they're working together, like Crash has to throw Cortex to make it to platforms, spin him like on wheels and all that. And once they get through all that, they end up back on the outside of the island, and they meet the villains of the game, the evil twins. And the evil twins explain that their plan, basically. Before you can make any progress, though, you end up back with Cortex, and Cortex, you know, he's just kind of enjoying himself, just standing there talking about how, like, he appreciates the lives of the natives and how simple it is.
How I envy the simple life of the tribesfolk. What have I got? What have I got? What have I got?
Although it doesn't really go well for him because bees start to come after him, so now, Crash has to sort of make sure that any obstacles in his way doesn't kill him. And a lot of stuff ensues. An entire beehive falls on his head, and then a bear sees that a beehive's on his head and starts chasing him. Cortex gets captured by the tribesmen, so that's sort of their return to the game. You have to go into their village, go through it, and save Cortex. Although sadly, when you quote-unquote save Cortex, he falls through the river and goes somewhere, and the tribesmen start chasing you. After you get through the tribesmen chase, armored chicken guy asks Crash and Cortex for help, and he tells them that if they smash the worm things, that he'll give them a crystal. Although unbeknownst to him, Cortex shoots him.
I'm an evil scientist. What do you expect? This isn't a game.
So they smash the worms anyways, and they get up the tree only to run into the evil twins again. And they basically bring to life like a tiki god that you have to fight. And after you fight the tiki god, Cortex mentions that he has an iceberg lair that he's gonna take Crash to. They get to the lab, and Cortex tries to open the door, but he can't. So Cortex and Crash have to find another way to get there. So Crash goes through some ice caves and whatnot, and as he goes through, he ends up running into Cortex again, who's having a conversation with Penguin.
The check bounced. Are you sure? Well, the past few years have kind of been slow. Wrath of Cortex didn't do as well as we'd hoped, and...
Fish?
You then control Crash holding Cortex again as he throws Cortex and spins Cortex at different enemies and gets them to reach platforms. They run into a frozen Uka Uka, which Crash throws Cortex into. Uka Uka says he doesn't know whether he should kiss them or kill them, as sort of as a joke. Obviously, he chose the kill option, so he uses the ice and makes like a big body out of it, and basically now Crash and Cortex have to fight him. After they defeat him, they explain to him that there's a greater evil that they need to take out, and Uka Uka's like, that's my job! So they do that, and Crash and Cortex think everything's good, because the masks are gonna go take them out. That doesn't really go to plan, though, as the masks end up getting defeated by the evil twins, and as Crash and Cortex get into the lab, the evil twins show up again. One of the evil twins messes up and accidentally mentions that there's riches they're looking for, so that intrigues Cortex. Cortex asks them why they're doing it, and they mention that Cortex ruined their lives, which Cortex doesn't really understand. So after they take out more ants, Uka Uka and Aku Aku are now wondering like what they meant by Cortex ruined their lives, and Cortex says probably one of the best lines.
I've ruined the lives of so many. I can't be expected to remember them all.
Cortex tells Crash they need to reach Engine's battleship before it sets sail. So they do just that. Crash does an interesting thing with Cortex in this one. I don't think that needs any further explanation. So they roll down the hill, they end up rolling into a snowball, and that pushes them down to Dingledile's little shack. And Dingledile hears Cortex talk about treasure that the villains were talking about earlier. Crash goes alone into Engine's battleship and fights through Engine's different minions until he gets to the Engine eventually, and once he gets to the Engine, they have like a little boss fight up in the air, and Crash defeats him, although when Crash falls, turns out that Engine has like an entire section of like dynamite that he accidentally blows up, and that blows Crash all the way into a little island where Dr. N Trophy and Embryo are just kind of chilling there, and they hear about the treasure, so they tell Crash that they want to get that from him, so Crash has to fight them, basically. Once Crash fights him, he eventually reunites with Cortex back in his lab.
My crystals!
And Cortex tells Crash that they need to find his niece Nina in the Academy of Evil. So they fly the blimp there, but they run into the evil twins again, and the evil twins explain that Cortex used to be Cortex's pets when he was a kid, and when Cortex was doing an experiment, he accidentally teleported them to another dimension, and that's how they became the way they were. So now Crash and Cortex go to Madame Amberly's Academy of Evil. They go into like a toxic section where they meet Dingledile and they have to take him down. Then they end up running into Nina again, who gets her own little gameplay section, and it's also the first time in the game you get to play as Cortex as well. Eventually, though, Cortex runs into his former teacher, Madame Amberly, and he has to fight her. They eventually make it out of the Academy of Evil, and then they end up back in Cortex's lab, where they can now teleport to the 10th dimension. So they do that, but they run into an evil Crash in the alternate dimension that grabs Nina. So now Crash and Cortex have to go save her, and evil Crash uses Nina as a skateboard, and Crash uses Cortex as a skateboard to chase them down. Once they get through that section, Crash sort of explores the place a little more, until he runs into his evil self again, who Cortex tries to stop from getting Nina, so he starts to chase after Cortex, and it's another one of those chase levels where Crash has to help Cortex now. With evil Crash out of the way, they explore the island a little more and end up in the evil twins' lair. So they go through that, and it's the final act of the game, basically. Nina, Cortex, and Crash all go together. That's a lie, Crash goes alone, while Nina and Cortex are somewhere else doing their own thing. So Crash gets to the end, somehow Nina and Cortex end up at the end in their own path as well. and they have to fight the evil twins in a boss fight. It's actually a really unique boss fight because you get to fight them as Crash, Cortex, and Nina, and you get to utilize their different power-ups. Eventually, though, Cortex is able to get Mecha Bandicoot to come over and help Crash fight the evil twins in it, and that's sort of how it ends, in a cool twist. And once they defeat him, the evil twins run away, and they end up in a pretty bad section because they end up in Evil Crash's hut, and Evil Crash, well, you can take a guess what happens.
Oh boy! I love roast chicken! Well, this is one heck of an ending.
With the adventure over, Cortex says that he's going to destroy Crash because he wants to stop what he started so many years ago. Although that doesn't really turn out very well, as Cortex gets transported into Crash's mind. And no future game talks about how he got out, so very cartoony kind of ending. Crash of the Titan starts off with Crash and the gang in a new island called Wumpa Island that they're staying in now. Although things don't go all too well, because Cortex comes in again with his giant blimp and basically tells Crash and the gang that he's back and he's gonna get revenge. So he fires basically cages at Aku Aku and Coco and fires a freeze ray at Crunch so Crunch can't do anything. So now Crash has to save Aku Aku and Coco. He eventually saves Aku Aku pretty early on and learns that he has a new power from Aku Aku because he can basically capture the bodies of different mutants and become them. And it was a very cool mechanic. You basically go through a jungle level first until you get to a temple area where you run to Cortex, and you get to do a lot of cool different moves on the way there. Like you get to like skate on the vines, you get to like jump on the things like Tarzan. Eventually you run to Cortex, who has Coco captured, and you gotta fight him in a boss battle. Well, as you're fighting him, you gotta capture the mutant that he's got and basically shoot the pillars down that he's on. Once you do that, Uka Uka already escaped with Coco, so that part of the plan's kind of messed up, and Cortex basically tells Crash that, like, they're screwed and that, you know, they can't do anything to stop him at that point. As Cortex returns to base where Uka Uka and Coco are, he gets told by Uka Uka that he's going to replace him because Cortex has failed him too much. These legendary scenes showed up before his replacement did.
Thank you, Master!
What? What do you mean?
Thank you again! Hotter than the first!
Unbeknownst to Cortex, he ends up getting replaced by his niece, Nina, who ends up tying him up as well. So Crash and the gang have to go find out what's going on. Crash and Aku Aku, I should say. They go to like a hillbilly desert sort of area, and they go through that. They meet like a roller mutant and a few different kinds of mutants. But by the time you get to the end of it, you gotta fight Tiny Tiger, who has the Mike Tyson voice for some reason.
Crash, I really am cross with you. I'm just trying to do my job, and you go and cause all this chaos. I'm sorry, but I'm gonna have to eat your face. Yeah, I'm really sorry about that. I wish some sort of reconciliation was possible here. And frankly, I'm still mad about the last game. You didn't even invite me. That really hurt.
But you defeat him, and then he basically gives up and all that. So now Crash and Aku Aku have to go to the island level in Sandy Beach to fight off Engine. You get through a tropical environment and then end up in Engine's factory area, and it gets more and more industrial and mechanical the further you go into the level. And by the end of it, you have to go through like an arena, like a stadium. You get to try out different mutants, like there's an ice mutant you can get. And once you get to the end of it, you have to fight Engine. And once you defeat him, Engine reveals to Crash that it's actually not Cortex that's in power anymore. He reveals to Crash that Nina is the one running things at this point. So now Crash and Aku Aku have to go find his brother Uka Uka and get answers from him. They then make it to Uka Uka's lair, and they fight through that, and they go through different, like, voodoo bunny people. They also run through, like, different tiki sort of places. And they end off in a temple where they get new power-ups, like an electric mutant. And you end up going to the boss fight where he is, and he reveals that he's got an evil, sinister plan, and that he's going to stop Crash and Aku Aku before they can go any further, and he morphs into like a giant, freaky mutant with the Evolvo Ray that Crash originally had used on him. Now they end up in the final act of the game where they go to Nina's lair and they have to fight through that. And they go through like Cortex's personal lounge area from the looks of it. Then they go into like a more sinister factory area that the Cortex robot is being used on. Eventually though, they end up making it to Nina and they have to fight her in her spider mech thing, and they do, and you have to use her to destroy the power supplies from it. And once they do that, Nina's basically all messed up, and Cortex and her escape as the Cortex mech that Nina was using falls on Wumpa Island, which makes a big mark there. Almost hits Crunch too, which is pretty wild. And that's basically the plotline of Crash of the Titans. We now get to the final game I will mention in the plot summary. I know I didn't mention the racing games, but they're kind of in their own little universe, so I kind of took them out of that. But anyways, Crash Mind of a Mutant starts with Cortex bringing Nina into another academy where where he can get his revenge on her for you know, taking his power originally. He also teams up with Embryo once again, who he's like the funniest character in that game, I gotta be real. I'll give you guys some top-class dialogue from him right now.
Greetings, little peons which I invented. You see before you a glorious history of evil devices that me, invented. Over time, the disgusting heroes of this world, which I invented, me, not Cortex, read your Bible, I wrote it. I created Slinkies! Stop playing with them because they're mine! Look, Light Bright, I didn't invent this. Bert Maya did. It's not evil, why is it in the pile?
The adventure starts out pretty basic. Coco needs Crash to go get a machine to get her thing working, because now they're working on the Cortex mech that fell on the island. So Crash goes and does that, he does it, and they get the screen working. And when they get the screen working, they see an ad for something called the NV. And Coco and Crunch seem very interested in it, to the point where they even get one free of charge, according to the ad. So they grab it, they put it on, and everything seems normal. They just seem really distracted by it, until Engine comes in to take out Crash and the gang. Crash has to defend them, and then he has to chase after Engine, which he does. And he eventually ends up in Engine's lair on Wumpa Island. And he has to, like, basically tell Engine to, like, get out of their way and stop bothering them. And Engine eventually does, after some convincing. He apparently wants to eat Crash's sister, according to some of the dialogue.
I have been watching you and your delicious sister.
Delicious?
Precious? I meant precious! I'm gonna eat her. Watch!
But they do that, and they look through his little viewer thing to see what Crunch and Coco are up to, and they seem to get transformed by the hats, which turns them into ravenous monsters. First things first, they gotta rescue Coco, which they do. They go up to the top of the Cortex mech and they have a boss fight with her. And once Coco gets brought back to normal, they basically look in the computer screen and it's revealed that Dr. Cortex, now working with Embryo, has betrayed Uka Uka to sort of get revenge on him for replacing him in the last game. Well, they basically tell Crash that he's got to go to the ice world, and so Crash takes a long journey all the way to the ice world, and I really do mean it's like a whole level to journey to that location. I actually remember it being really cool at the time. But basically, once you get there, you're on the hunt to find Nina to get some information on him. So they go to the ice world to go and find her. Unbeknownst to them, though, as they explore and get through it, they find out that Nina's not where they thought she was, and the only way to get to her is through a roller, basically. And they need to get that roller in the desert world, which means they have to travel all the way back to Wumpa Island, all the way to the desert world, and then after that, they have to travel back. So it's like a whole convoluted thing. They go to the desert world, they get the roller, they go all the way back to Wumpa Island, all the way back to the ice level, I shit you not. And they finally gain access to the Academy of Evil that Nina's in. Different from the one from Twinsanity, though. So they go in there, meet Nina, and Nina needs their help with something, which is protecting her science experiment. So they help her with that, and Nina gives Crash and Aku Aku some information. Nina tells Crash and Aku Aku that Cortex is working with Embryo again, and as they go back, and they tell them that they need to go the other side, back to the desert level again. So they gotta take that whole journey. But before that, their island gets attacked by a bunch of mutants. So now they gotta take care of them first before they go to Dr. Embryo. And after that, that's when they eventually go towards Embryo. And it's in the desert level, and there's like a path you could take that leads you to like a garbage, slimy sort of area that you go to, and you gotta go through that, and you get to meet the slime mutants and all that. Once you get through that, you finally run to Crunch once again, who's been taken over by Embryo with his NV, so you have to fight Crunch and Embryo at the same time. Once you save Crunch, though, Embryo kind of just up and leaves and gives up. And now Crash and Aku Aku have to find Uka Uka, who's in a cave somewhere. And they get some information on that, and they travel all the way through again to that cave level. And once they do, they see a cutscene that's like a South Park parody. They finally get through that, and then they run to Uka Uka, who has been milked by Cortex.
I was so tired of that guy. Felt like I married my mother. Not that I've thought about that.
Now Uka Uka wants to get revenge and tells Crash and Aku Aku that in order for them to help him, that they need to get 3 pieces from 3 different levels. Luckily, though, this time there's teleporters that'll take you to them, so you don't really have to worry about much in that regard. After that, they make it to the final act where now that they got all the pieces, now they can teleport to Cortex's new space station. This is probably like, what, the 3rd or 4th one he's had? But they teleport to that, they go through the station, and then they run to Cortex, and Cortex uses some of Embryo's mutagen and transforms into a giant monster, so that's basically the boss fight. You gotta, fight him. You can even capture him like a regular mutant, and you get to destroy stuff with him, which is pretty fun. After that, you defeat Cortex, although all is not well, because the space station starts to crash, and now Crash and the gang have to find a way to get out after Cortex also found a way to escape. So Crash and the gang do eventually make it out, but now their island's more filled with technology because the spaceship now crash landed on the island. And that's pretty much the plot of Crash Mind Over Mutant and the Crash series in general. In my opinion, Crash Mind Over Mutants, for now, until they make like another one, is the last Crash game for the moment. But, it's a very long franchise, and I feel like they'll probably have a new game sometime in the future. But for now, this is my list. Hope you all have a good one, and thank you for listening to my plot summary of Crash Bandicoot, and I'm out. Peace.